What unsettles people most about this story is not the cousin himself, but the reflection he leaves behind. Because once you hear his story, you begin to notice the silences in your own history, the relatives never spoken of, the names missing from the family Bible, the photographs where one face is always turned away. Every family carries secrets, but not every family dares to bury them in stone. His existence forces us to ask, what have we chosen not to see? The cousin did not choose his fate. He was born into a bloodline already too tangled, too fragile, too secretive to give him a chance at a normal life. His confinement was not only a punishment, but a symbol, a desperate attempt to keep shame hidden away in the dark. Yet by hiding him, the family only ensured that when he was found, the truth would come crashing down with twice the weight. Some say he died quietly in a care home years later, his last words no more than the same broken names he had whispered in the basement. Others insist he never adjusted, that his mind never left those stone walls even after his body was freed. There are those, too, who believe he still lives, tucked away under another name, his past erased by paperwork and silence. Perhaps that is the greatest cruelty. His story can never be fully known, because the people who carried it with them would rather take it to their graves than admit what they allowed to happen. But his shadow remains. In the house that fell into ruin, in the records that don't quite line up, in the whispered warnings passed between generations. It is a shadow that reminds us of the cost of silence, the dangers of blood turned inward, and the horror of what happens when love is warped into possession. When you walk past an abandoned house in the countryside, you might feel it. The weight of eyes that were never meant to be seen, the echo of a voice that was never all allowed to speak, and maybe you'll remember the cousin in the basement, not as a monster, not as a victim, but as the haunting proof that history hides its darkest truths, not in books, not in records, but in the lives we were never supposed to find. In time, the cousin became less a person in the town's eyes and more a symbol. He was whispered about in diners, in church pews, in the hushed corners of the grocery store. Some spoke of him with pity, others with disgust, and a few with something darker, fascination. It was as though his very existence had given shape to the nightmares people tried to bury. He was the evidence no one wanted but could never forget. The authorities debated what to do with him. He was too fragile for prison, too unprepared for the outside world to be left on his own. Some suggested state care, but the facilities were not equipped to handle someone who had been raised in near-total confinement. And so he lingered in limbo, alive, but unrooted, passed between institutions like a secret everyone wanted to move along, but no one wanted to claim. Meanwhile, the house decayed further, collapsing in on itself. Nature began to reclaim it, the roof caving in, vines wrapping around the porch, animals nesting in the hollow spaces. Yet even as the structure rotted, it carried a weight that locals swore they could feel. Hunters avoided the property. Travelers turned their eyes away when passing the road. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a scar carved into the land itself. And within that scar lay more questions than answers. Who built the basement in the first place, and for what purpose? Was it meant to store food, or was it always a prison? Did the cousin truly live there alone, or were there others before him, lost and forgotten, their names never spoken? The silence of the family offered no clues. Their line faded with time, scattering, marrying into other names, disappearing into records that no one would dare to trace too closely. The cousin's story, however, refused to disappear. Every retelling grew darker, every version twisting the truth into something larger, almost mythic. Some said he wandered the fields at night, long after his supposed death, a broken figure searching for the only home he ever knew. Others swore that the basement itself was cursed, that the air beneath the floor still carried the sound of his cries, echoing endlessly in the stone. But perhaps the most unsettling truth was this: he wasn't unique. He was not the only one. He was simply the one who was found. After his discovery, rumors spread faster than truth. Some said the cousin was dangerous, that he lashed out like an animal when taken from the basement, clawing and biting as though the world itself was attacking him. Others claimed he was docile, almost childlike, staring with wide eyes at every light bulb, every movement, every sound of modern life he had never heard before. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between. He was not violent by nature, but he was terrified. And terror can look like rage when it has nowhere else to go. The town wrestled with its guilt. For years they had walked past that house, waved at the family in their fields, exchanged polite words at the general store, all while ignoring the faint cries in the night. Some claimed they never heard anything. Others admitted they had, but convinced themselves it was the wind or the call of some animal. But silence is a choice, and silence had kept him in chains for nearly a lifetime. Officials wanted answers. How long had he been there? Why was he never registered? Why was his name absent from every school record? The family refused to cooperate. They spoke in fragments, contradicting each other, as though the truth had been buried so deeply, even they no longer knew where it ended and where the lies began. To outsiders, they looked like criminals. To themselves, they believed they were guardians. And the cousin, sitting in the corner of a hospital room under fluorescent lights, did not understand why strangers asked him questions he could not answer. He could speak, but only in half-formed words. He knew his own name, but not how old he was. He remembered faces, but could not tell which were real and which were only dreams repeated too many times in the dark. His memory was a patchwork stitched together from whispers, shadows, and silence. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed silent like the rest? Because the deeper you look into this story, the harder it becomes to separate judgment from survival, cruelty from protection, horror from love. And that's what makes this case so haunting. It doesn't fit neatly into villain and victim. It lingers, unsettled, like a mirror held too close to the face. The cousin's body told a story his mouth could not. His shoulders were narrow, almost sloped downward, his spine slightly twisted as if the bones had grown without instruction. His hands were the most unsettling, long, thin fingers that curled inward, trembling constantly, unable to rest. His teeth jutted at odd angles, some broken, others never grown at all, and his jaw seemed too small to contain them. Every part of him bore the signature of blood turned inward, folded back on itself until the design collapsed. Doctors who examined him later spoke in hushed tones. They noted the missing chromosome markers, the compounded defects that mirrored case studies of children born from generations of inbreeding. But science, for all its certainty, could not explain the weight people felt when standing in his presence. He was living proof of something forbidden, something society wanted to pretend didn't exist in its own backyards. He was the nightmare made flesh. The family remained silent through questioning, but their silence was not ignorance. It was defiance. They had lived by their rules for decades, perhaps centuries, believing the outside world was corrupt while their blood remained pure. To them, he was not a mistake. He was their legacy, no matter how broken. And in their eyes, it was outsiders who were intruding, forcing shame onto something they had never thought of as shameful. But the truth could not be contained anymore. The town began to murmur, then whisper, then finally speak aloud of what had always been suspected. Old photographs resurfaced, family portraits where faces seemed too alike, too symmetrical, like mirrors of mirrors. Records were unearthed of marriages between first cousins, of births that were never recorded, of deaths written off as accidents, but whispered about differently in private. The house became more than a rotting building on a quiet road. It became a monument to everything no one wanted to face. Some called him a victim, others called him an abomination, but the truth was more complicated. He was both. He was what happens when secrets are locked away too long, when shame is disguised as tradition, when blood is treated as currency instead of connection. He was not just one man, one cousin, hidden in one basement. He was the echo of every choice that family had made, and every silence the town had kept. And in the darkness of that echo, the story was only beginning to unfold. When investigators finally entered the basement, they described the air as heavier than any cellar should have been, as though it had been sealed for centuries. The walls were stone, damp with years of condensation, and the floor was lined with scraps of old blankets and hay. In the corner sat a rusted bed frame, the mattress so thin and torn that it was hardly more than fabric stretched over metal springs, and on the walls, deep grooves carved into the stone by fingernails that must have clawed for years. He had been there long enough to leave marks of himself in everything around him, small drawings scratched into wood, strange symbols that no one could quite decipher, circles upon circles, names spelled wrong but repeated endlessly, as though he were trying to preserve the fragments of memory given to him by those who visited. His world was not wider than those 4 stone walls, yet inside it he carried an entire mythology of the family that left him there. Neighbors recalled faint sounds late at night, a kind of moaning, sometimes rhythmic, sometimes breaking into shrill cries. Most assumed it was the wind scraping through the old chimney. Some knew better but chose not to speak. In towns like this, secrets are not broken. They're buried, layered in silence, until even the children know not to ask. And so the basement continued to breathe in the dark, holding a life that no one dared to acknowledge. When asked why no one intervened, the town said the same thing. It wasn't their place. The family kept to themselves, they didn't bother others, and the land was theirs. In rural America, privacy is as sacred as survival. But beneath that excuse lies something deeper: fear. Fear of knowing what really lived in those hills, fear of confronting how easily blood can become its own prison. And in that silence, the cousin grew. He grew without sun, without school, without the sound of another child's voice. He learned only what his keepers whispered to him in the dark. He learned names, but not stories. He learned hunger, but not freedom. And when the door finally opened and the outside world poured in, his first reaction wasn't joy, it was terror, because to him, the outside world was the stranger, the intruder, and he was not prepared to leave the only world he had ever known. The house where he was found still stands, though few dare to approach it. The wood has rotted, the windows stare back like blind eyes, and the wind seems to whisper through the cracks, as though the walls themselves remember what they've seen. Local children sometimes throw rocks at the old place, daring one another to step onto the porch. But even in daylight, there's a heaviness that clings to it, as if the soil beneath carries the memory of every sin committed inside. It began generations earlier, when isolation was not a choice, but a way of survival. Families in the mountains, cut off from towns, learned to marry close, believing it was better to keep land and blood together than risk strangers who might betray them. Cousins joined with cousins. Brothers and sisters shared names that were supposed to stay separate, and over time, the family tree bent inward, curling back on itself until there was no fresh branch, no new leaf. Only repetition. By the 3rd generation, the deformities began to show. Children with wide foreheads and narrow jaws, or ears that twisted strangely against their skulls. Some were born silent and never breathed more than a few minutes. Others lived, but not fully. They walked unsteady, spoke in half sounds, and looked at the world through eyes that never focused quite right. In the town's records, many of their births were unmarked. They were ghosts before they were ever alive. The cousin in the basement was not an accident. He was not hidden by chance. He was hidden because he carried the truth of everything the family had tried to keep from the world. His existence was proof of a bloodline that had turned in on itself so tightly it suffocated the life it was meant to sustain. To look at him was to look at the cost of secrets too carefully guarded, and yet the family did not see him as cursed. To them, he was kin. He was theirs. In the silence of that stone room, he had been fed, clothed, and kept alive, though not free. They believed they were protecting him from ridicule, from the cruel eyes of a world that would not understand. But what they really protected was themselves, from shame, from exposure, from the truth bleeding into the open air. They found him in the basement, not a child, not a man, something caught in between like a life that had never been given permission to grow all the way. His eyes adjusted to the sudden light with an almost animal panic. wide and glassy, his jaw slack, lips quivering, as if he had never known strangers existed. Dust clung to his skin like a second layer, and in that first moment, when the heavy wooden door opened and the light flooded down the narrow steps, everyone knew something had been hidden here for a very long time. The neighbors whispered about the house for decades. They said the family who lived there didn't much bother with outsiders, that blood was all they trusted, and blood was all they kept. But no one knew what was locked away beneath the floorboards. No one guessed there was a cousin so inbred that even his features betrayed the secret, an uneven face that seemed stitched together from generations too closely bound, eyes that never quite aligned, fingers bent at impossible angles. He didn't speak at first. He only made a sound, low and throaty, the kind of noise you would never forget because it didn't seem human. And when he finally did whisper words, they weren't in sentences. They were fragments of names that had been repeated so many times inside that house over so many years that they blurred into something like a prayer or a curse. When the family was asked why, their silence said more than their words ever could. They didn't deny him. They didn't claim him. They only stared at the ground, at their worn shoes, at the dirt that had fed them and cursed them all the same. And that basement, cold, dark, lined with stone, wasn't just where they kept him. It was where the truth lived, the truth that would haunt anyone who dared to look too closely. Some people said he was the last one, the last cousin born of that closed loop, that unbroken circle of blood turned in on itself. Others swore there were more, hidden deeper, in places no one was meant to find. But the record of his discovery, the day the basement door opened, became a wound in the memory of the town, a wound no one wanted to touch because if you did, you might see too much of yourself staring back.